Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale. I am joined by Christoph.
Christy Talk. What? Oh, yes, it's me. All right. Hey, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad all of you are here. And I'm excited to hear what we're going to talk about.
What is today?
The first day of the rest of our lives.
Today is a date that stands as one of the darkest and most defining moments in the history of the U.S.
Oh, okay. Yes, that too. It is Pearl Harbor Day.
So today we're going to dive into the human side of the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. But instead of walking only the well-known path of Battleship Row, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the headlines we all know, we will focus heavily on the lesser-told stories. The sailors, Marines, nurses, airmen, and ordinary people whose voices rarely appear in the documentaries. Most of us have heard the broader strokes, the Japanese strike force crossing the Northern Pacific, the Sunday morning surprise, the burning battleships, America's entry into World War II. But a great deal of what happened that morning is made up of small moments, personal moments that reveal what it felt like for the people who lived through the opening minutes of the American War. And today, we begin with the atmosphere on Oahu before the first aircraft appeared overhead. To understand the shock of what happened, I want you to picture the scene on the morning of December 7th. The sun was just rising over the Koolau Range. Church bells across Honolulu were getting ready for the first services of the day. On Ford Island, sailors were waking up slowly, thinking about Liberty plans, breakfast at the mess, and maybe the football game scheduled for later that day. For most of them, the biggest concern that morning was whether they had enough time to write home before the next watch. Some of the younger sailors, especially those newly assigned to battleships like the Pennsylvania or the California, were still adjusting to Navy life. Imagine being 19 years old, halfway across the Pacific, far from home, and waking to a warm, calm Sunday. One thing stands out from many eyewitness accounts: peace. A sense of peace so complete that it makes what followed feel even more jarring.
I have to think that there were some surfers also that were chilling. I have yet to see a documentary where it has to do with as many of the natives and what they're up to, but from what I understand, surfing's kind of a big deal over there.
Yes,
Okay.
surfing is pretty big over there.
So, I'm sure imagine you're catching a nice wave, and then, no pun intended, wave after wave of zeros fly over you. I don't mean to jump ahead too far, but it's jarring for everyone,
That
not
would be
just the
terrifying.
surfers. Yes, I have to imagine just normal life, but the tension of, yeah, war's probably coming, but nobody expecting it's coming today.
One little known story comes from a sailor aboard the destroyer USS Ward. In the early dawn, long before the Japanese aircraft arrived, the Ward had already fired the U.S. Navy's first shots of the Pacific War at a midget submarine outside the harbor entrance. Many Americans have heard of the submarine, but far fewer know what happened afterward. Young sailors aboard the Ward tried desperately to report the submarine sinking, but the message was met with delays, confusion, and disbelief. One sailor later recalled that after sounding general quarters and returning to a tense quiet, he sat on a crate near a gun mount and thought to himself, "If anything else happened today, I prayed someone would listen." Someone did, but too late.
Oh.
Another lesser known account comes from a Navy nurse named Lieutenant Annie G. Fox, stationed at Hickam Field. She had been up early that morning preparing for what she called a routine Sunday. She expected a slow day of paperwork, not mass casualties. Her calm professionalism would later earn her the first Purple Heart ever awarded to a woman during World War II.
Wow.
She wrote later that morning, "So still that even the palms seemed to rest." These accounts remind us that December 7th began as an ordinary day. Thousands of people were living and working around the harbor that morning. Sailors aboard the battleships were scrubbing decks, preparing for inspections, or still asleep in their racks. Marines at their guard posts were chatting quietly. Civilians were preparing breakfast in their small homes nearby. Aboard the USS Ogalla, a mine layer tied up next to the cruiser Helena, one petty officer was standing on the deck enjoying the sunrise. He later recalled that the water in the harbor was so calm that it looked like a sheet of glass. On Ford Island, ground crews were moving slowly, checking aircraft, sipping coffee, thinking about a relaxed day ahead. Many of them remembered hearing the first drone of approaching aircraft and assuming it was a group of American planes returning from exercises or training. No one was expecting war. Here's another of the lesser known threads in the story: faint warnings and overlooked signals that seemed obvious in hindsight. A radar station on Opano Point detected a large formation of incoming aircraft just after 7 o'clock. Two young Army privates, George Elliott and Joseph Lockhart, saw the signals on their radar screen. They called it in, but the lieutenant on duty dismissed the sighting as a flight of American B-17s, expected
Oh.
from the mainland. On the battleship Nevada, a boatswain's mate remembered noticing distant aircraft approaching in a formation he did not recognize. He mentioned it quietly to a shipmate, who shrugged and said it was probably nothing. To the men on the ground and on the docks of ships across the harbor, the idea of an enemy attack simply wasn't part of the Sunday morning world they lived in. I want to highlight one more little known moment from that morning: a story from a mess cook aboard the USS Curtis, a seaplane tender moored near Ford Island. He recalled later that his biggest worry that morning was that the coffee had come out too strong. He said he kept adding water to the pot trying to fix it. He never imagined that in less than an hour, he'd be carrying wounded crewmen and dodging machine gun fire. These moments matter. They give life and dimension to a day that is often portrayed only through strategic maps and dramatic explosions. But before those explosions, before history locked December 7th into the American memory, there were thousands of personal, ordinary, and almost peaceful moments. And it is those small human details that make the contrast of what happened next so stark.
I think that's one of the things that I've enjoyed over the past several episodes is that personal connection to the people involved in the conflict. When you hear about what's going through the mind or recorded in a log or what is said in passing, it reminds you that these are people. And I know you think about that in the very general sense everybody does. It's like, yeah, there were soldiers, there were sailors, there were pilots. These people interacted, but to know that each one has a name and a family and a connection and the threads of their lives composing a part of the tapestry of the world and how it's burned out, like it's destroyed in a moment, and how significant that is, and the repercussions that come from that in many other people's lives. We may have listeners that had relatives at this event and lost them, and they're still dealing with that. I really appreciate how you walk us through an event and what it means, like at a human level.
Now we arrive at the moment when that calm Sunday morning shattered. Before most sailors had even reached for coffee, before church bells finished their first rings, the Japanese First Wave Strike Force, 183 aircraft, bore down on Oahu. Their targets were Battleship Row, airfields, and any American aircraft that could rise to defend the island. We often hear the strategic details: the torpedo bombers, the dive bombers, the fighters, But today we're going to walk through this wave through the eyes of the people who were there, especially those whose stories rarely get told. The first wave was seen by dozens of people before the first bombs fell. A Marine private at the Navy Yard remembered looking up and noticing the aircraft coming in unusually low. What caught his eye wasn't the engines or the formation, but the glint of sunlight on the underside of the wings. He nudged the sailor standing next to him and said, "Those aren't ours." Aboard the battleship West Virginia, a junior officer was preparing to shave when he heard the first explosions. He thought a boiler had blown somewhere. By the time he reached the deck, he saw the torpedo plane streaking across the water. One of the least known eyewitness accounts come from a milk delivery man who was driving through the base to drop off his morning load. He recalled seeing a Japanese plane fly so low over his truck that he could see the pilot's goggles. He said the moment felt dreamlike, impossible, as he stepped into the wrong world. For a few seconds, everyone struggled to understand what they were seeing. Then the torpedoes hit. The Japanese had trained relentlessly with modified torpedoes designed to run shallow in Pearl Harbor's relatively low depth, and when they hit with devastating force. One sailor aboard the USS Nevada recalled the sound of the first explosion as a deep metallic thud that you felt in your ribs more than you heard with your ears. He said he froze, soap still in his hands, dripping onto the deck. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, the first torpedo struck the port side and rocked the ship violently. A Marine bugler on deck remembered being thrown to the ground. He got up and instinctively reached for his bugle, and then realized he has no idea what to call even applied to this situation. Instead, he grabbed a rifle and ran towards his post. The West Virginia took multiple torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack. A cook aboard her recalled the galley erupting in chaos, pots rattling, sailors scrambling, someone yelling that the ship was sinking. He said that the smell of breakfast mixed with the heavy stench of fuel oil as the ship began to list. These small recollections, rarely included in official accounts, show the human side of these opening seconds: confusion, instinct, and the sudden understanding that this was war. We know that the Arizona exploded catastrophically when a bomb struck her forward magazines. But before that happened, there were brief human glimpses of life aboard the ship. A seaman second class aboard the Arizona recalled running to his station on deck when he heard a chief petty officer yell, "Get topside. This is not a drill." He said the chief's voice, usually steady and unshakable, crackled with urgency he had never heard before. Another sailor, a young man from Ohio, who had enlisted only months earlier, was standing near turret 2. He remembered the heat from the first fire starting aboard the ship. He looked over the railing and saw a Japanese torpedo plane pass so close he could see the pilot's scarf. Seconds later, the bomb struck. The forward magazine erupted. Almost the entire center of the ship blew apart. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The blast was so powerful that sailors on nearby ships felt the shock wave through the soles of their boots. Many men aboard the Arizona never had time to react. Their stories end in that moment. But a handful of survivors later described being thrown into the water by the explosion, surrounded by debris, oil, and fire. At Forward Island, where much of the Navy's air power was concentrated, the Japanese targeted parked aircraft. Their goal was simple: prevent American fighters from taking off. A mechanic at Forward Island later said he saw a Japanese Zero strafe the line of aircraft and watched them erupt in a fire, as if someone had thrown a match onto dry grass. He dove under a truck for cover and felt bullets passing through the sheet metal above him. Across the island, an aviation machinist tried to get a P-40 fighter started, even as bullets kicked up dirt around him. The engine coughed once, twice, then died. He pounded the dashboard and shouted in frustration. Nearby, a group of maintenance men ran across the runway, dodging strafing runs, searching for any aircraft that might still be salvageable. The first wave turned Forward Island into a field of burning metal within minutes. Hickam Field, just a short distance from Pearl Harbor, was hit almost simultaneously. Many of the lesser known stories from that morning come from ground personnel. A clerk typist who had never fired a weapon in his life ran outside and grabbed a machine gun that a fallen airman had dropped. He said he did not even know how to load it properly, but he fired anyway, just to do something, he later put it. Lieutenant Annie Fox, the nurse mentioned earlier, went straight into emergency response. Within moments, she was organizing wounded men on the floor of the base hospital, stepping over broken glass, giving orders, calming panicked airmen, and working under a constant rain of bombs and machine gun fire. Her calm discipline under chaos saved countless lives. In these opening minutes, something extraordinary began to unfold. Across the harbor, across the airfield, across the entire island, ordinary people made instantaneous decisions. Decisions driven not by training manuals or orders, but by instinct, teamwork, and courage. Firemen from Honolulu raced towards smoke columns without knowing whether more bombs were coming. Sailors dove into burning oil slicks to rescue shipmates. Marines manned machine guns that were never intended to protect against a strike of this scale. Civilians pulled wounded strangers into homes and garages and treated them with homemade first aid. This was the beginning of the human story of Pearl Harbor, not just the destruction, but the response. As the final aircraft of the first Japanese wave pulled away, the harbor was already a hellscape. Battleships were burning. Aircraft lay shattered along runways. Smoke darkened the morning sky. Sailors and Marines were fighting fires, tending to wounded, and trying desperately to understand what had happened. And worst of all, they knew more was coming. Because by the time the fires on the Arizona were roaring, the second wave of Japanese aircraft were inbound.
I'm really struck by it's such a huge turnaround from expectation at the beginning of the day to what happened. And I guess it's just an element of what happens with most surprise attacks that from warfare, like not a 9/11 type situation, but you're still prepared. You have a heightened sense of awareness. An attack could happen at any time, and then it happens or not. This seems different. Even though they were preparing for war, nobody expected that. And just the psychological impact of going from one extreme to the other, going from mild readiness at best to you're in the thick of it and you need to act now, I think tells me a couple things. One, the training and the drilling that you talk about repeatedly in other episodes, that's really where this shines. It comes to bear at moments like this. I can't think, I don't have the capacity to compose a thought, but training just kicks in, like the bugler who instinctively picked up his bugle but didn't know what to play. I think I appreciate the work that goes into this training and the drilling and the constant preparedness, and I'm grateful that our Navy has that capability, that even when a surprise comes, there is some action. It's never going to be as much as a planned attack, for example, but this is what's going to unfold as you speak is just a demonstration of the quality of leadership and discipline in our military. And this is always a difficult topic, I think, when I start really deeply thinking about it, the human impact.
When the first Japanese wave pulled away, the sailors and Marines at Pearl Harbor were already in the fight of their lives. Battleships were burning, the harbor was choked with black smoke and drifting oil fires. Airfields were shattered, and thousands of stunned men and women were trying to make sense of the destruction around them. But they had no time to regroup, no pause, no chance to catch their breath. Because the second wave, 171 more aircraft, were already bearing down on Oahu. Between the first and second wave, there was a strange brief pause. Survivors described those minutes as an eerie clarity. Aboard the destroyer USS Helm, A young sailor remembered looking up and seeing the sky momentarily empty of planes. He said the silence felt unreal, as if the attack had simply stopped because it all seemed too overwhelming to continue. But then, as he watched the smoke rise from the Arizona, he realized something. This was not over, not even close. A coxswain on the USS Maryland recalled shouting orders through a bullhorn, trying to organize firefighting crews as wounded men lay nearby, calling for help. He said he felt it like his voice was lost inside the noise, drowned by the roar of burning fuel and the cries from shipmates trapped below decks. On Ford Island, a chief petty officer was dragging hoses towards a blazing hangar when he heard someone yell, "More planes are coming in from the south." He later said that was the moment he understood, truly understood, that everything happening around him was part of a coordinated, massive assault. If the first wave focused on battleships and airfields, the second wave went after infrastructure, repair yards, and any surviving aircraft. And unlike the first wave's destructive shock, the second wave arrived to find Americans already firing back. Machine guns, rifles, even pistols were shooting skyward. Ammunition crews were running boxes of rounds by hand. Damage control parties were everywhere. And all across the harbor, men were learning quickly, painfully, in real time. One of the most dramatic and lesser told stories of the second wave involves the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack. At the start of the attack, the Nevada had already returned fire with her anti-aircraft guns. By the time the second wave arrived, the ship's captain realized she could move. And move she did. A boatswain's mate remembered the deck vibrating as Nevada's engines powered up. He recalled sailors cheering, not because the battle was won, but because the ship was still fighting. But the Japanese noticed immediately. A moving battleship was a much more dangerous threat than a stationary one. As Nevada began to steam down the channel, she became a primary target. Dive bombers peeled off, one after another. Bombs fell close, then closer. A pharmacist's mate aboard Nevada recalled seeing water rise in massive plumes on both sides of the ship. Then one bomb hit near the bow. Another followed. The ship began to list. There is a remarkable eyewitness story from a gun crew member who said he felt the ship lose her balance beneath him. He looked out over the harbor, saw the wreckage, and thought, if we sink here, we block the channel. No one gets out, no one gets in. The commanding officer made a split-second decision. Beach the Nevada, save the channel, save the harbor. The crew steered her towards Hospital Point, ran her aground, and kept firing until their ammunition was gone. The Nevada, battered and burned, survived, and her actions prevented even greater disaster. Another lesser-known story from the second wave includes the USS Ogallala, the mine layer moored next to the cruiser Helena. The Ogallala had already been damaged earlier in the attack, but during the second wave, she took additional punishment. A machinist mate later recounted standing in waist-deep water below decks, trying to patch a hull breach with whatever materials he could find. Mattresses, beams, and even toolboxes. He said the water kept rising, and at one point, he found himself working in total darkness, guided only by the sound of rushing water and the feel of cold steel under his hands. Eventually, the order came to abandon ship. As the men climbed out, the Ogallala rolled slowly onto her side. Most Americans know the names Arizona, Oklahoma, and California, but the Ogallala's story deserves to be remembered too. The second wave brought even more destruction to the airfields. At Wheeler Field, home of the Army's pursuit aircraft, an armorer described running ammunition belts to surviving P-40s. He said he was nearly hit by machine gun fire twice, and at one point had to dive into a ditch filled with muddy rainwater to avoid a strafing Zero. A pilot at Wheeler managed to reach his aircraft, one of the few not destroyed, and climbed into the cockpit with shaking hands. Another ground crew member helped pull chocks while the plane's engine roared to life. The pilot later recalled that he did not know whether he would survive takeoff, but he did. And he joined a handful of American pilots who made it into the air that morning. They fought against overwhelming numbers, often alone or in pairs, and still managed to shoot down several Japanese planes. At Hospital Point, located near where Nevada ultimately beached herself, something remarkable happened during the second wave. Doctors, nurses, corpsmen, and even civilians turned the grounds into a massive, improvised triage center. A Navy dental assistant who had never treated battlefield injuries found himself compressing chest wounds and applying tourniquets to sailors covered in burns. He later said he remembered thinking, I was trained to fix teeth. Now I'm trying to save lives. A civilian woman who lived nearby ran to the hospital with a basket of clean linens. She spent the next several hours wiping soot from wounded men's faces, pouring water for the dying, and whispering words of comfort. One corpsman stood at the harbor's edge, pulling sailors from the water as they swam away from burning ships. He said he lost count of how many he dragged ashore. There are the quiet human acts of heroism that filled the spaces in between the explosions, the parts of Pearl Harbor history that rarely get told in school books. By the time the last planes of the second wave turned towards the open ocean, the attack was over, but the nightmare was not. A machinist aboard the USS California later said, the bombs stopped falling, but the real fight had only begun. Fires were still raging, ships were flooding, men were missing, trapped, wounded, or desperately trying to escape compartments filling with smoke and water. All across the harbor, men began to move with grim determination. Damage control, firefighting, rescue attempts, medical aid, and the grim work of removing the dead. What remained was not just devastation. It was a test of endurance, skill, and courage. The battle had ended. Survival had not.
That's sickening to a degree. Just there's one thing to prepare for the military life and knowing that you're going to get in conflict and knowing that you'll be attacked at some point. But having to jump in situations where your training isn't there, such as the man who had never fired a gun, but he felt like he needed to do something, and so he's firing off machine guns. Seeing planes so close, you can see the scarves and goggles of the enemy pilots. And then when it's all said and done, really getting caught with your pants down and losing so many capital ships, and then having to deal with the dead that you can reach, knowing that there's more dead or soon to be dead at the bottom of the harbor. That's, gosh, what a horrible feeling that must have been for every single man and woman in that area. Every time I think about this, I always think about, like you said at the top of the episode, in retrospect, oh, why didn't they get that warning about the planes coming in or notice the formations were different or any messages that may have come in earlier that it may have been dismissed? Everything becomes fodder for, we could have done this differently. And the reality is mistakes are made. And the best thing you can do is not harangue yourself over that mistake, but just say, okay, what do we do now that we're here? And so I'm sure maybe not in this episode, but in other World War II related episodes, we'll see what we did. It was in direct response to this, and we made strategy changes, and our eyes were more open to the threat of the Japanese Empire, for sure.
The attack had ended. The sky was finally empty. But in many ways, the real struggle, the fight to save lives, to salvage ships, and to bring order to chaos, was just beginning. December 7th is remembered for the explosions, the flames, the noise. But what many people never hear about is the long stretch of hours afterward, the desperate work that unfolded in choking smoke, twisted steel, and oil-covered water. This part of the story is not about strategy. It is about people. Witnesses describe the harbor after attack as something out of another world. Oil fires burned on the surface of the water, thick black waves of flame drifting across the harbor, trapping sailors who had jumped overboard. One signalman aboard the USS Tennessee recalled seeing men swimming through burning oil. He said it looked impossible. Men pushing their way through a sea of fire, their faces barely above the surface, coughing and gasping as they searched for a gap in the flames. Sailors used anything they could find: wooden planks, life rings, even floating debris to pull others from the water. A boatswain's mate from the USS West Virginia dove into the harbor repeatedly, bringing wounded shipmates back one at a time. He later said he did not remember feeling fear. He remembered only seeing hands reaching up from the water. While rescue efforts took place on the surface, inside the ships, things were far more dire. Darkness, rising water, smoke, and twisted metal turned compartments into deadly mazes. Few Americans know the story of the men trapped inside the USS Oklahoma after she capsized. The ship rolled over so quickly that hundreds of men were caught inside airtight compartments. One survivor remembered clawing his way through pitch-black passageways filled with cold water. He said he felt bodies around him, floating, bumping into his legs as he tried to stay calm. Some men managed to find air pockets. They banged on the hull with wrenches, hoping someone outside would hear them. And someone did. Rescue crews on the surface brought cutting torches to the overturned hull. They listened for tapping, faint signals from men fighting to stay alive. They worked for hours, cutting through armor plating, careful not to ignite trapped pockets of gas. In one section, 32 men were rescued, pulled out through narrow openings, covered in oil, and shaking from shock. Many said they had no memory of how long they were trapped. Time had dissolved into darkness. The West Virginia's crew displayed heroism that rarely makes the headlines. Hit by multiple torpedoes, the ship was rapidly flooding. The crew fought to contain the damage. One officer ordered counter-flooding to keep the ship from capsizing. This was an extraordinary decision, intentionally flooding parts of the ship to prevent a total roll. A young seaman later recalled helping close watertight doors to feel alone. He said he could barely see his hands, and the water was rising fast enough that each decision felt like the difference between life and death. Even in the chaos discipline held, men followed orders, stayed at their posts, and carried out damage control duties under the worst possible conditions. The West Virginia eventually settled on a relatively even keel because of their efforts, a fact that saved lives and made future salvage possible. The Navy Yard itself, often overlooked in retellings of Pearl Harbor, became a massive firefighting and rescue zone. A Master Chief electrician at the yard remembered running through burning debris, directing teams of men to restore power to pumps and emergency lighting. He said they had almost no working equipment left, so they improvised constantly, using scraps of wire, scavenged hoses, and damaged generators. A group of civilian workers, many of them welders and machinists, volunteered instantly. They boarded damaged ships while fires were still burning, knowing full well that secondary explosions were possible. One welder later said, "We did not think, we just went." Across Oahu, hospitals and makeshift aid stations overflowed with wounded sailors, Marines, civilians, and airmen. At the Navy Hospital near Hospital Point, a corpsman recalled seeing so many burn victims that he could not distinguish one from another at first. He said he forced himself to look into each man's eyes to connect, even briefly, so they knew they weren't alone. Nurses worked into the night. Medical supplies ran low quickly. Some nurses cut blankets into strips for bandages. Others used fountain pens as makeshift airway tools. One doctor performed emergency surgery on a sailor on a picnic table outside the hospital because every operating room was full. He said the sound of distant explosions echoed through the walls, even hours after the attack ended. While the military response is often remembered, civilians played a massive role that morning and afternoon. Honolulu fire crews responded to the Navy yards under heavy enemy fire. This was the first time in Hawaiian history that civilian firemen responded to a battlefield. Many had never worn helmets or protective gear suited for combat conditions. A city fire captain remembered seeing two of his men hit by shrapnel as they approached a blazing hangar. He yelled at them to retreat. They refused. Civilians donated blood, opened homes for injured sailors, cooked food for exhausted Marines, and helped transport victims to hospitals. There are even accounts of school teachers helping gather children indoors as stray rounds from the attack hit neighborhoods miles from the harbor. As the sun set on December 7th, the harbor was still burning. Rescue efforts continued through the night. The glow from smoldering ships lit the water with an eerie orange light. A sailor aboard the USS California remembered standing at the rail that evening, looking out across the harbor and thinking, nothing will ever be the same. And he was right. The attack had changed the world. But that night, the men and women of Oahu were not thinking about geopolitics or strategy. They were thinking about the missing, the wounded, and the hard work ahead. They were thinking about survival and resilience.
I think this is very much like I was talking about earlier. Everybody pitching in, training kicking in, a mentality to save their fellow sailor or fellow combatant above their own life even. The fact that I'm not the strongest swimmer, but diving in again and again to save trapped sailors, that's extraordinary to me. But at the same time, it's what every sailor would do, right? This is when push comes to shove, this reveals character. And every circumstance and story that you're telling about here is revealing that character. And I think this is fundamentally why the U.S. Navy is so effective, because it's not only are they a team, like on paper, but just in and of themselves, the character either not just impressed upon them during training, but revealed is incredible. And so every sailor knows they can count on their bunkmate or the guy on the bridge, or every link of the chain of command is behind them and has them and will make decisions that will help as many sailors as possible. And as devastating as this attack is, and as really specifically for the lives and families of the people lost here at Pearl Harbor, so much courage is shown and so much resolve, and that resolve translates to the nation. Like, the citizen sees what they had to endure and what they went through and what they did, and that manifests in them a strength to do the same. And I appreciate the courage of these American sailors and support personnel as well. Firemen, nursing staff, everybody. Everybody really was not expecting this, but they showed up. And showing up is over half of what needs to happen.
When dawn came on December 8th, 1941, Oahu woke to a world transformed. The air still smelled of smoke and scorched fuel oil. Ships still burned, some listing, some already sunk. Fires smoldered everywhere, and the water of Pearl Harbor carried a thick black sheen that reflected the glow of a new sunrise. The attack was over. The long day of rescue efforts had passed, but the emotional shock, the immense loss, and the staggering reality of what had happened were only beginning to set in. December 8th was not a day of battle. It was a day of reckoning, of counting the missing, of searching compartments filled with water and darkness, and of realizing that the United States was now at war. Many eyewitnesses said the morning light on December 8th was somehow worse than the attack itself. With daylight, the full extent of the damage became visible for the first time. A sailor aboard the USS Maryland later said that when the sun came up, he felt as if someone had lifted a veil. He had known the night before that the losses were terrible, but he had not understood the scale until he saw the outlines of the sunken Arizona and the overturned Oklahoma emerging from the water. The harbor looked like a graveyard. A machinist from the Navy Yard recalled walking along the piers that morning and feeling frozen in place, standing at the wreck of the West Virginia. He described it as a giant wounded animal, smoke still curling from its superstructure. But even as men tried to process what they saw, the work continued. One of the most heart-wrenching parts of December 8th involved the search of flooded compartments aboard sunken or damaged ships. The salvage and rescue teams worked methodically. They brought pumps, cutting tools, ropes, lanterns, and even carpenter tools. The work was slow, dangerous, and emotionally devastating. A diver who entered the hull of the USS Oklahoma described the water inside as ink black, cold, and full of debris. He moved by feel alone, reaching out with gloved hands, searching for survivors or remains. He later said that the silence inside the wreck was overwhelming. No engines, no explosions, just the sound of his own breathing through the diving gear. Some compartments still held air pockets, but no survivors. Others were completely flooded. Men who worked on these efforts rarely spoke of them later. Even decades afterwards, they said the memories were too painful. By mid-morning, officers across the harbor began compiling preliminary casualty lists. The numbers grew quickly and grimly. Ships reported their wounded. Others reported how many men were unaccounted for. A yeoman at Fort Island said he was assigned to record the names of the missing from one of the battleships. He later described feeling numb as the list grew longer and longer. Not numbers, but names of friends he had eaten breakfast with the day before. For some ships, like the Arizona, the loss was almost total. The scale of death was difficult to comprehend. Sailors stood in line outside their ship's tents or assembly area, hoping to report in. An officer scanned the gathering, recognizing who was missing simply by absence. One of the more haunting accounts from December 8th came from a postal clerk at Pearl Harbor. He recalled pulling in the morning mail delivery. Sacks of letters, packages, Christmas cards, and early holiday gifts. He looked at the names on the envelopes. Many of them were addressed to men he knew would never read them. He later said that moment, more than the attack itself, made him understand the enormity of what had happened. Honolulu was a city in shock. Civilians were coming to grips with the attack in their own way, and the fear of follow-up attacks was real. On December 8th, radio broadcasts urged citizens to remain calm. Roadblocks went up. Military police patrolled the streets. Rumors spread rapidly. Some believed paratroopers were coming. Others thought the Japanese fleet was about to land Marines on the beaches. A store owner in downtown Honolulu remembered checking on his shop early that morning and seeing several sailors asleep on the sidewalk outside. They had spent the night fighting fires or searching for survivors and had simply collapsed from exhaustion. He brought out a pot of warm rice and shared it with them. He said it was the only thing he could think to do. With hospitals overwhelmed and the number of dead quickly rising, improvised morgues were set up in hangars, warehouses, and even open-air tents. A Navy chaplain at Hickam Field recalled spending the morning of December 8th offering prayers over rows of bodies laid out beneath tarps. He said he had never before witnessed such loss and had no words adequate for what he saw. Volunteers from Honolulu, including nuns from local missions and high school students recruited by the Red Cross, helped document personal items, tag remains, and offer comfort to grieving families. These stories rarely appear in official histories, but they reveal the deeply human cost of the attack. Around midday, Hawaii time, radios across Oahu broadcast President Franklin Roosevelt's now famous address before Congress, the Day of Infamy speech. One sailor recovering in the hospital remembered hearing the president's voice on a small bedside radio. He said he could barely follow the words, but he remembered the feeling. America was going to fight back. A civilian school teacher in Honolulu recalled gathering children around a radio in the classroom. Many of them were too young to understand the significance, but she said they sat in total silence, watching her expression as she listened. The attack had not just brought America into the war, it had united a country in a single moment of resolve. On December 8th, the military began rapidly transforming the island into a defensive stronghold. Barbed wire went up along beaches. Anti-aircraft positions expanded. Camouflage crews worked non-stop, covering buildings and equipment under nets. Sailors were armed and positioned on rooftops throughout Honolulu. A Marine lieutenant remembered receiving orders to dig new defensive lines above the harbor. He said it struck him as surreal. One day he was just playing football on the base lawn, and the next he was preparing for a possible invasion. By the end of December 8th, rescue efforts continued, but a somber quiet settled over the island. Aboard the USS Nevada, now beached near Hospital Point, a group of exhausted sailors gathered on deck, staring out over the harbor. One of them said quietly, "We are still here." That simple statement captured the mood of the day. Pearl Harbor was wrecked, but not defeated. The Navy was battered, but not broken. And although the wounds were fresh and the grief overwhelming, the determination to rebuild and to fight was already taking shape.
Everything you're talking about resonates in a way that I can only connect with the event of 9/11. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners may feel similarly. The one moment in time where a devastating loss occurs and everybody is wondering what to do. When you mentioned that story about the sailors that collapsed exhausted after fighting fires, and the shop owner just offers them a warm bowl of rice because that's the only thing he could think of to do, that is incredibly meaningful. That was a connection. It's like, hey, I see what you're doing. I see you're exhausted. Let me come by and help you in the best way that I can. And there was a lot of that in New York City. I remember, I guess now 24 years ago. And there are listeners that don't remember that event at all, or were born after that event. And that's how I connect to Pearl Harbor. It's like that happened so much. Believe me, I'm younger than Pearl Harbor. It happened so long ago, and I don't really get the magnitude of it, except through stories like this, except through connecting it with something that I do know about, and seeing the same responses from people around. Everybody's shocked. Everybody's struggling to find out what to do next. First, it's let's take care of what is in front of us, rebuilding Pearl Harbor, recovering the dead, etc. But then what? And knowing that there is a resolve to fight back is comforting to a lot of people because it's such an intrusion, such a violation, like personally to the people of Hawaii. That happened, and knowing that someone's got your back and we're going to make sure that this doesn't happen again is comforting. You never want to have something like this happen again, but inevitably something like this will happen again just because of the power dynamics of the world. And I'm just grateful to live in a land where people help, where people look out for each other.
December 7th and 8th are the parts of the story most people remember. The fire, the smoke, the explosions, the chaos. But what followed in the days and weeks after the attack is equally remarkable, and in some ways even more revealing of the strength and resilience of the U.S. Navy. But what happened next was not defeat, it was determination. The men and women of Oahu, sailors, Marines, civilians, divers, engineers, nurses, looked out across a harbor of burning, sunken ships and made a decision. We are going to rebuild. We are going to return to the fight. And they did. The Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, already respected for its technical skill, suddenly became the focal point of one of the largest salvage operations in naval history. The task was enormous. 21 ships were sunk or badly damaged. Many were filled with oil, mud, debris, and in many cases, the remains of the fallen. A foreman rigger at the yard later said, "No one asked if it could be done. They asked, "When are we starting?" The salvage effort began almost immediately after the fires were under control. Divers inspected hulls. Engineers surveyed damage. Pumps were brought in to clear compartments. Cranes moved into position. One diver, who had worked on submarine rescues before the war, described his first descent along the hull of the USS California. He said the water was so full of oil that even his flashlight barely penetrated the muck, or the murk. He said to feel his way along the steel plating with both hands just to avoid becoming disorientated. He recalled thinking, "This ship feels like she is asleep." He then corrected himself. "No, she feels like she is waiting." The salvage crews faced not only technical challenges, but emotional ones. Many of the ships still held the remains of their crews. Divers, carpenters, and riggers often worked knowing what they would find behind a sealed door or inside a flooded compartment. A civilian welder assigned to cut access holes into the USS Arizona's hull later said he had nightmares for years afterward. He described opening a submerged section and seeing what he called a snapshot of the moment the world ended. Another man, a young sailor who volunteered for recovery duty because he felt he owed it to the men still aboard, said the silence inside the wrecked ships was sometimes worse than the noise of the battle. He described hearing only water dripping in the darkness and knowing the ship had become a tomb. These are the stories that rarely make it into the documentaries, but they are essential to understanding the emotional toll the aftermath of Pearl Harbor took on everyone involved. Despite the overwhelming damage, the salvage teams worked miracles. Some ships were raised months faster than predicted. Others were rebuilt almost from scratch. The West Virginia, hit by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, was expected to be a total loss. But her crew's early damage control efforts kept her upright, and the salvage teams eventually refloated her. One diver recalled hearing a faint metallic echo from inside during a routine inspection. For a moment, he thought it might be a survivor, months after the attack. Instead, it turned out to be a loose cable tapping in the currents. He remembered feeling both relief and sadness at the same time. West Virginia would eventually return to service in 1944, fully modernized and ready for battle. The USS California's salvage was one of the most complex operations. She had sunk slowly, filling with oil and mud. Divers worked in near zero visibility for hours at a time. A chief boatswain's mate told a story about climbing aboard the California months after the attack and finding a sailor's locker still open, a shaving kit sitting exactly where it had been on the morning of December 7th. He said the sight of it felt like time had frozen. The California, like the West Virginia, returned to the fleet and later fought in the Pacific. The Nevada, despite being heavily damaged, was among the first to be repaired. Her determination to get underway during the attack had already made her a symbol of resilience. A ship fitter who worked on the Nevada said he took pride in hammering the warped steel back into shape. "I wanted her to look proud again," he said. And she would. The Nevada returned to duty and ultimately supported the landings at Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Not every ship could be saved. The USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma were too badly damaged. Work on the Oklahoma focused on recovering remains and preventing her overturned hull from becoming a hazard. In later years, she would be righted and refloated, but her fighting days were over. Salvage workers said she was the hardest emotionally. A ship where so many had died trapped beneath decks. A ship that had rolled so quickly that chaos reigned inside. The Arizona became a memorial almost immediately. Her fires burned for days, fueled by tons of oil. When the fires finally stopped, salvage teams assessed the wreck and realized she could not be repaired or raised. A young sailor involved in the early inspections later said standing on the remains of the Arizona was like standing on sacred ground. Today, the Arizona remains exactly that, One of the remarkable outcomes of the Pearl Harbor attack was how quickly the Navy adapted. In the weeks after the attack, anti-aircraft defenses were expanded dramatically. Radar systems were improved and fully integrated. Training intensified. Ships across the fleet increased damage control readiness. Aircraft and pilots were rushed to the Pacific. A sailor stationed at Pearl Harbor in early 1942 later said, "We turned the place into a fortress. Nothing like December 7th was going to happen again." While Pearl Harbor rebuilt, the United States Navy and the entire nation shifted to a war footing. Recruitment surged. Shipyards worked around the clock. Families on the mainland hung gold stars in their windows. The country was united in a way it had not been in decades. One Marine who survived the attack put it this way: "They woke a sleeping giant, but what they really did was wake its heart." The resilience shown in the days and weeks following Pearl Harbor set the tone for the entire Pacific War. Ships returned to battle stronger than before. Sailors who had fought for their lives returned with sharpened resolve. And the memory of those lost on December 7th became a driving force for every task that followed.
It's nice to see the response, and I know we have the benefit of hindsight, but it's whenever something so devastating happens, either collectively like this or even personally in somebody's life, it can really knock them back. And knowing that you have to go through the arduous task of waiting for the fires to die down before you can collect the dead, or things that need done that are extremely difficult that give people nightmares for years. Yet you have the resolve to do it. That I think I see it with some of my children, and it's immaturity to a degree, but it's also commonplace. A lot of people don't want to do what needs done. And there is a task set before you, and there is a right thing to do, and it can be exceedingly difficult. And it is our choice to do them or not, but it benefits everyone, including yourself, to go through that difficult thing and get through it. And I cannot imagine if the devastation of Pearl Harbor occurred and we just wrung our hands and we were indecisive and we were wishy-washy, and that there were people that could be saved and were saved in reality, but maybe wouldn't have been because we delayed. There is a right thing to do. You have to be decisive, especially in situations like this. And I just keep coming back to hearing these stories and saying, I'm so glad those people had the resolve and the will to do that. And you've been to the Arizona Museum, right?
Yes, I'm from Oahu.
Okay. So you're very well versed in this history. What I've not been. What is that? I imagine it's eerie and solemn.
I want to describe it as eerie, but it is very solemn.
Okay. Maybe
It
eerie, yeah.
is.
Eerie is probably not the right word.
It is a place that epitomizes our resilience. And it is a place to remember everyone we lost that day.
I'm glad that memorial exists because it's important to remember both the loss and reminders that we can get through something like that as we work together, but that we should never forget that it occurred. You know what I mean? So every time we talk about Pearl Harbor, I just get that feeling, and I'm just grateful for the folks and how they chose to respond.
As we come to the final chapter of this episode, we step back from the immediacy of the explosions, the heroism, the smoke-filled chaos, and the rebuilding. Instead, we look at something broader, the legacy left behind by the men and women of December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is a moment frozen in time, but its meaning has grown and changed with each passing generation. It is not just a historical event. It is a story of lives interrupted, courage revealed, and a nation transformed in a single morning. The survivors of Pearl Harbor carried the events of that day for the rest of their lives. Some talked openly about their experiences. Many did not. A gunner's mate from the USS Helena once said he did not tell his own family about what he saw that day until nearly 30 years later. When asked why, he said, "You do not want the people you love to carry the things you still struggle to carry yourself." Others coped through humor, grit, or pride in the role they played. A Marine stationed at Pearl Harbor later described the attack as the worst day of my life and the day I learned the most about what people can do when everything goes wrong. For families on the mainland, the impact was just as profound. Telegrams bearing devastating news began arriving within days. Mothers and fathers opened envelopes that would change their lives forever. One mother in Kansas kept the Western Union telegram informing her of her son's death inside her family's Bible for the rest of her life. She later told a relative, "I want the words near something that reminds me he is safe." Survivors groups formed within a few years of the attack. Men who had fought side by side under unimaginable conditions found in each other the only people who fully understood what the day had taken and what it had taught them. Many survivors described their comrades from Pearl Harbor as a second family. Others said the friendships they made afterward helped them heal from memories they could not face alone. One sailor from the USS Nevada said that each time he met another Pearl Harbor veteran, he felt like I was meeting a brother I had not known I had lost. For many Americans, the most visible symbol of Pearl Harbor is the USS Arizona Memorial, built directly over the remains of the battleship. But what the public often does not know is how survivors felt when they first visited it. A Marine who had been stationed at Pearl Harbor returned in the 1960s to see the memorial for the first time. He stood quietly on the white platform, looking down into the water where oil still seeped to the surface. Small black drops known as the tears of the Arizona. He later said, "I felt like the ship was still speaking." Families of the fallen often describe the memorial as a place where they can connect with loved ones whose graves are at sea. The silence inside the memorial is profound, broken only by the water below and the hushed footsteps of visitors. The USS Oklahoma, long overshadowed by the Arizona in public memory, has its own powerful legacy. For decades, many of the men lost on the Oklahoma could not be individually identified. Their remains were buried as unknowns. But starting in the 21st century, the Defense Department undertook a remarkable project using DNA analysis and historical records. Dozens of Oklahoma crewmen have been identified and returned to their families for proper burial. Some families waited more than 70 years for closure. One elderly sister of an Oklahoma sailor said that her brother's burial, "I was just a child when he left for the Navy. Now I am the last of my family, and I finally got to bring him home." The attack reshaped the United States Navy, not just in what ships were built, but in how sailors trained, how officers led, and how the fleet prepared for war. Its lessons included the importance of readiness even in peacetime, the need for advanced reconnaissance and radar integration, the value of damage control training, the necessity of rapid mobilization, and the power of resolve in the face of overwhelming loss. One naval historian once wrote that the sailors of Pearl Harbor gave the modern Navy its spine. And if you talk with sailors today, many will tell you that the memory of Pearl Harbor is not distant memory. It is part of the Navy's cultural identity. As decades pass, historians continue to uncover personal diaries, letters, and oral histories that offer new depth to the Pearl Harbor story. A diary from a 19-year-old radioman discovered in a family attic in the early 2000s revealed his quiet reflections in the weeks after the attack. He wrote, "I am not afraid anymore. I am only determined. I want to go back to sea. I want to do my part. I want to honor the men who are not given the chance." Letters like these bring us closer to the individuals whose lives were forever shaped by the attack. Pearl Harbor is often described as the moment the United States entered World War II. But on a deeper level, it was the moment Americans understood that the world had changed. They had a part to play in shaping what came next. Factories began producing ships, planes, and weapons at a pace never seen before. Men enlisted by the millions. Women filled vital roles at home and overseas. Communities held drives for scrap metal, rubber, and war bonds. The whole country turned towards a difficult but determined future. The nation did not give in to fear. It answered with unity. As we close this episode, I want to leave you with an image often described by survivors. On the night of December 7th, after the flames finally died down, a group of exhausted sailors stood together on Ford Island. They looked over the harbor, still smoldering, filled with wrecks, illuminated by flashes of distant fires. One sailor broke the silence and said, "We will come back from this." He was right. They did. The United States Navy did. The nation did. And the legacy of those who fell, the men whose names are engraved in white stone, the men who rest beneath the waves, continue to shape the Navy, the country, and our understanding of courage itself. Pearl Harbor is not just a story of loss. It is a story of resilience, of determination, of ordinary people who stepped into history and bore its greatest weight. And it remains to this day one of the defining moments in the history of the United States Navy.
I couldn't have said it better myself. That was incredible.
Typically, we honor one of our fallen angels at the end of our episodes, but today we would just like to honor all of the men and women who gave their lives during Pearl Harbor. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this episode. I like reflecting on the humanity of the warriors and the participants in the conflicts that we talk about. And it really gives a connection to the past that we might not otherwise have. Instead of just some sterile date or event, we can connect through our shared experience, our humanity. And I hope you enjoyed it too. If you want to get a hold of us, maybe you were at Pearl Harbor during the bombing and you would like to chime in, we would love to hear from you. Or perhaps you have a relative. Give us a shout. You can do that a couple different ways. You can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter with the handle USNHistoryPod. And alternatively, we have a Discord. You can join that and talk with us and other listeners and chat about whatever. I need to get back on there and just stir it up a little bit. I think that would be good. If you could rate and review also, tell a friend, family member, coworker, classmate, even casual acquaintance, hey, we ride the same train. You should listen to this. And then maybe they will, and maybe we'll get to share stories with them as well. We thank you for listening, and hope to catch you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.